Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate this big turnout. It was some point over the weekend when I realized that the NCAA Men's Championship is also tonight. And I got on ESPN and I was like, please don't be at 7, please don't be at 7. It's not, it's at 9, so stay seated. We'll be doing that church bag rattling in 10 minutes until you gotta go. You gotta go get in line at the Cracker Barrel. I'm Wiley Cash. I'm the Executive Director of Literary Arts here at UNC Asheville. I teach some fiction writing, I teach some literature, and I run the Common Word Community Read, which is a program that we have here to try to bring the campus and the community together around a single text. Last semester, we read and discussed Coach John Thompson's autobiography, I Came as a Shadow, and we capped off our semester by hosting Georgetown legend Sleepy Floyd. And this semester, as you know, we read Wilmington's Lie, and we are hosting Pulitzer Prize winner David Zucchino this evening. So it's a wonderful program, and you know, we have our annual Day of Giving coming up on April 17th, and you know, gifts to things like the Common Word Community Read allow this kind of thing to happen. So we would really appreciate a gift if you feel inclined to give it. If you've gotten something from this series, we would love it if you wanted to give something in return. That would be really wonderful. I want to say just very briefly that I have already chosen our fall selection. It's going to be 13 Moons by Charles Frazier, which is the first novel that was translated into the written Cherokee language. This is a novel about Cherokee removal, and Charles will join us for the final event this fall as well, just like David is doing tonight. So that'll be a lot of fun. It's a wonderful novel. It's a rich novel. It's an historical novel. It's the kind of novel that only Charles Frazier can write. So I hope you will pick that up and give it a read over the summer and be ready to jump into some of these events in the fall. But tonight, our guest is David Zucchino. David is the winner of the 2021 Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction for the book we're discussing tonight, Wilmington's Lie, The Murderous Coup of 1898, and the Rise of White Supremacy. He's a contributing writer for the New York Times. He's covered wars and civil conflicts in more than 24 countries. He was previously awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his dispatches from apartheid South Africa, and he's a 4-time Pulitzer Prize finalist for his reporting from Iraq, Lebanon, Africa, and Philadelphia. He is the author of the books Thunder Run and Myth of the Welfare Queen. And I will also say that he is the proud father of a UNCA alumnus who at this moment is on the way to the hospital where she is giving birth sometime soon. So let's enjoy David Zucchino while we have him. That's real dedication. Some of y'all were like, I might not go tonight. It's nice outside. This man's about to have a grandchild. He came. Give me a break. So David, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. So this book is called Wilmington's Lie. It's about the race massacre of 1898. And much of that, well, I would say all of that happened, especially Wilmington as a targeted city, because of the kind of city that Wilmington was in 1898. So can you paint us the picture of what North Carolina's port city was like at that time?
Yeah, good evening. Wilmington in 1898 was really an outlier. It was probably the only major southern city that had a black majority. It was 56% black. That was highly unusual. But the other thing that distinguished Wilmington, it didn't have black men in positions of power and authority. 3 of the 10 city councilmen were black men and 10 of the 26 policemen. That was quite unusual at that time. The superintendent of streets, the city treasurer, the postmaster, the coroner were all black men. And what really rankled whites was that many blacks were magistrates. And they would hear cases in which there were white defendants. And this just irritated the heck out of the white supremacists who had been used to running Wilmington from the founding of the city. Now, after the Civil War, a lot of black men and formerly enslaved people gravitated to Wilmington. It was the largest city in North Carolina at that time. And there were tons of jobs. It was a major port. In fact, it was the last port to fall during the Civil War. And when the port fell in February of 1865, the war was essentially over. That was the only way Confederates were getting their materiel was through Wilmington. Wilmington was also a railroad terminal, and there were jobs on the railroad, and it was also the center of the naval stores industry, pitch, tar, and turpentine. So there were all these jobs, and after one quick generation, black men had moved into the middle class. And Wilmington was unusual in another respect in that some of their neighborhoods were integrated. I mean, segregation was still the law of the land in the South, but there were neighborhoods, particularly working class neighborhoods, where whites and blacks lived side by side. That was really unusual. There was also a very prominent professional class of black men, doctors, lawyers, funeral directors, and teachers, which again was unusual for a southern city to have black men spread throughout society and had this powerful middle class and even a professional class.
And wasn't it the customs master, right, was a black man, and he made more money than the governor did?
Exactly, yes. He was the collector of customs. It was a federal appointee job, and he did make more than the white governor, which, again, rankled the white supremacists, and he had replaced a white supremacist, who in fact was one of the men who manned a machine gun that went after black men and attacked black men on the day of the coup. In fact, Keenan Stadium is named after him. William Randall Buck Keenan, but anyway, he had been the former collector.
And one thing that really surprised me, I live in Wilmington, my kids are born there, my kids are actually out there in the lobby right now, and my wife is from there, but I was surprised, and I only recently learned this, and I think it was after reading your book, what a cosmopolitan city Wilmington was for middle-class black men and women and families, and a lot of that came because of the ports, that these were men working in the ports who had traveled the world, who spoke multiple languages, who knew, what was coming during the Civil War before the people in Wilmington knew what was coming during the Civil War, because they were experiencing the world in a way that white supremacists staying home never would, right?
Yeah, many of the blacks were more worldly and cosmopolitan than the whites were. There was a lot of connection with the Caribbean because of trade in Europe. And in fact, Wilmington's black men had the highest literacy rate of any black group in North Carolina. So it was, again, a very unusual city, and that is the main reason the white supremacists decided that this situation couldn't last any longer. They called it, quote, Negro rule and Negro domination. It wasn't only a small percentage of these offices were held by black men, but through their propaganda campaign, they made it seem like black men had taken over Wilmington, which wasn't the case at all.
And one of the things that really upset the white power base, which would have been the Democratic Party at this time, was the Fusionist Party. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Fusionist Party was, where it came from, and how it was affecting change, moving toward equality, class equality, racial equality at the turn of the century?
Yeah, you have to remember at this time, the Democrats were the party of white supremacy and the Republicans were the party of Lincoln and black suffrage. But the whites of the Populist Party, who had previously, they were mostly white supremacists, who had previously supported and aligned with the Democratic Party, became really upset with the white power structure, the bankers and the railroads and the lawyers, and they felt that they weren't addressing their concerns. Their concerns were farm prices and educating their kids. So they gravitated over to the Republican Party, which meant that they aligned themselves with black voters, these newly enshrined black men who had the right to vote. And they created this fusion party, which gave the power of the working class whites plus black men, who in Wilmington, again, were a majority of 56%, along with white Republicans. So this was a really powerful movement. And in I believe it was 95, they took over the state legislature and the government in Wilmington. And that's when the white supremacists decided at that time they were going to lay this plan to remove black men from public office and remove the right to vote.
And so the decision to sever and break apart the fusionist party along racial lines was a conscious decision. And it was spearheaded by two very powerful North Carolinians. Josephus Daniels, who was the owner and publisher of the News and Record in Raleigh, and Furnifold Simmons, who was state chair of the Democratic Party. So can you tell us a little bit about their meeting? Was it in New Bern
It was in New Bern, yeah. In March of 1898, they met to lay a plan for what they called the white supremacy campaign. They were very proud of it, and that's the name they used, and they were very open about it. And their plan was to crack this fusion between poor whites and blacks by spreading propaganda to incite white men against blacks. And it was an incredibly successful campaign led by Josephus Daniels, the publisher of the News and Observer in Raleigh, which is still published now. And they, first of all, they attacked black men as sexual beasts. The term they used was the black beast rapists. And the News and Observer and other white supremacist newspapers spread the lie that there was a reign of terror and a series of a rape epidemic of black men against white women, which wasn't true at all. They also focused on what they said were incompetent and illiterate black men in public office, and they had to be removed. And they were so effective in their newspaper stories that they started to turn all whites, but particularly the poor whites of the fusionist party, and inciting them to violence. And in addition to the propaganda campaign, they had a military campaign. They had vigilantes. They were called red shirts. They were essentially the KKK. They also had two militias, the Wilmington Light Infantry and the Naval Reserves. These were essentially the National Guard of the day, but they were completely made up and commanded by white supremacists, and they were under the direction of the white leadership of the city. So between this propaganda campaign and this military campaign, as part of the military campaign during the summer and fall of 1898, the red shirts would ride out into the countryside and break into black homes and yank black men out and whip them and beat them and say, if you register to vote, we'll come back and kill you. So they were able to tamp down the black vote, at the same time using the propaganda to turn whites against blacks.
Yeah, there were three kind of men they were looking for, and I told you that I would help you remember this, and I wrote it down so I would remember it as well. Men who could write, men who could speak, and men who could ride.
Yeah, the men who could write were obviously the newspaper, the propagandists like Josephus Daniels and the other editors of the white supremacist papers throughout North Carolina. The men who could speak were the orators, like a former Confederate colonel named Alfred Moore Waddell, who was the leading speaker. He was the Donald Trump of his day. He was an incredible speaker and could really incite white men to violence. And he gave a lot of fiery speeches. I'm going to read a little bit from one that he gave the night before the midterm elections in November. And then there were men who could ride, and these were the red shirts and the two militias I mentioned.
So if we hang on to that and just hold that in our mind, and we think about maybe our contemporary moment or how these kinds of coups are manifested in other democracies or in other countries, people who can write, people who can speak, and people who can ride. You know, the people who will lead the violence, people who will propagate the violence, and people who will speak the violence. It's a really potent and a very, very effective cocktail. And one thing that I always find very interesting about the men who can write, it's not only Josephus Daniels writing these really, really fiery editorials that are going out across the state. It's not only the News and Observer. I said the News and Record. That's Greensboro's newspaper. Let's just tar them too. Who knows? But it wasn't just men who were writing. It was men who were drawing political cartoons. And can you speak a little about why it was so important for those political cartoons to get out there?
Yeah, in North Carolina at the time, almost 25% of the white electorate was illiterate. So Josephus Daniels figured out a way to reach these men through a cartoonist. He hired a cartoonist named Norman Jennett. And some of these cartoons are in the book, but they were just vicious cartoons. They depicted black men as apes and vultures and beasts, literally just grasping. They had long claws, and he drew cartoons of them grasping at fleeing white women. They were horrible, racist cartoons, but they were incredibly effective in inciting white men to violence.
And so Wilmington was kind of a flashpoint. Wilmington was the place that they had targeted because, as a friend of ours, I've heard of our friend John Jeremiah Sullivan say before, Wilmington was the city where Reconstruction was working.
Yes.
It was a city where the Freedmen's Bureaus, all the promises of Reconstruction were actually taking into effect, and where democracy and capitalism were working for everyone. Too well, some would say.
Right.
But it was working for everyone. So this was a statewide campaign, but Wilmington was really the focal point where they knew there was going to be violence, where they had made sure that also it wasn't a secret. Can you talk about how kind of public these notions were? I mean, they were calling in journalists from around the country to come to Wilmington.
They were very open about it. They even had a White Bill of Rights. They had a handbook for the white supremacy campaign that instructed whites on the tenets of white supremacy. And they announced what they were going to do. They said they were going to take over the government by the bullet or the ballot or both. And this naturally drew the attention of the major newspapers of the day, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Chicago Tribune. Every major paper in the country sent their correspondents down to cover what they called the race war in Carolina. And when they got to Wilmington, got at the train station, they were met by the white supremacist leadership, and they gave them cigars and whiskeys and arranged for places for them to stay. And they also took them around and filled them with the white narrative, which was that it was black men, not white men, who were gathering up arms and planning to rise up and take over the government, to kill white men and women and take over the city. That was the story they put out. And the white press, to their everlasting shame, believed it. They believed every word of it. And that's the story America got, was that there was this incompetent, illiterate, violent, black mob, basically, about ready to rise up. And the white supremacists believed their own propaganda. They arranged for white women and children to be out of town for the election for fear of this black uprising. That was a complete figment of their imagination, but they actually believed it. But when the white reporters got there, that's the story they spread to the rest of the nation. And I read a lot of newspaper stories, and this thing was really well covered, hundreds and hundreds of stories, and I never found one in which these white reporters interviewed a black person. The story was told completely from the point of view of the white supremacists.
You talked a little bit about the rumors of a black uprising, and a lot of that tied to the still fresh memory of the Nat Turner uprising, and also the rumors of the sexual deviancy with black men going after violent attacks on white women in this misinformation campaign. Can you talk about the power of misinformation in that moment specifically?
Yeah, I mean, it really turned poor whites against black men and really incited them to violence. And in fact, George Roundtree, one of the white supremacist instigators, wrote in his memoirs that he was terrified when he went to a meeting once to rile up these white men, and then came away thinking, wow, they're too riled up. They're ready to kill every black man in the city, and they were. So it was extremely effective, and this man, Waddell, Colonel Waddell, was very effective. And if it's okay now, I'll read from his, he gave a really fiery speech the night before the election. The election was 2 days before the coup, and in fact the coup was planned for 2 days after the election because they planned to steal the election. And this is, if I can get my glasses out, hold my mic at the same time.
And I'll say, as he's preparing, but Alfred Moore Waddell was kind of an interesting charlatan character. He had he had a tendency to side with power. So sometimes he was in favor of the federal government, and sometimes he was against the federal government. So when he saw an opportunity, he saw the leadership vacuum that was presented in the months leading up to the insurrection and the coup. He swooped in and he filled it. He felt the unrest, and he swooped in and filled it and became the leader and the voice of it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And in fact, he was resented by a lot of the white leadership. They thought he was a blowhard and a phony, but he was such an effective speaker, they sort of gave him this starring role the night before the election, this huge rally of 1,000 white men at Thalian Hall, all riled up and just ready to go out and kill. And here's part of his speech. Quote, "Men, the crisis is upon us. You must do your duty. This city, county, and state shall be rid of Negro domination once and forever. You have the courage. You are brave. You are the sons of noble ancestor. You are Anglo-Saxons. You are armed and prepared, and you will do your duty. Be ready at a moment's notice. Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find the Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls. And if he refuses, kill him, shoot him down in his tracks."
So can you tell us a little bit about what Election Day was like in 1898?
Yeah, as I said, the white supremacists, the Democrats had predicted that they were going to steal the election, and they did. First of all, they sent the red shirts out into the streets to intercept any black men who actually worked up the courage, under these circumstances to try to get to the polls. They intercepted quite a few, they intimidated them, threatened them, beat up a few, and it really tamped down the black vote. At the same time, they sent the red shirts into polling places where they swarmed in, 50 or 100 men, and just took over and intimidated the voting officials there. And most of them, they would start a fire, and in the confusion, they had these phony Republican ballots already written up, and they would stuff them in the ballot, literally stuff them in the ballot boxes and pull out the Republican votes. They had phony Democratic votes, pull out the Republican votes. So that in some precincts there were more winning Democratic votes than there were voters in the entire precinct. So the election was a fraud, but they won, and they took over not only the county offices in Wilmington, but the state legislature. And from their plan was, from that position of power, 2 days later, they would rise up and remove the municipal government, which was not up for re-election until the following March, but they weren't going to wait till March. On November 10th, their plan was to rise up and remove the government by force.
And I think you have another reading that speaks specifically to the coup itself.
Yeah, this is from the day of the coup. After the violence had started, the white men on the corner had opened up on a group of black men who were essentially unarmed. They only had a few weapons because the hardware stores would not sell to black men, but obviously they sold to white men. And Wilmington at the time had more guns than there were white women and children in the entire city. So they were extremely well armed, and the blacks weren't. But this is just a description of some events on the start of the coup. Thomas Clausen, the white reporter, followed a wounded black man from North 4th and Harnett into a home at 411 Harnett Street. He encountered 3 distraught black women. On the floor behind them was a black man named Bazell, dead of his wounds. On a bed, Clausen found the owner of the house, George H. Davis, also a black man, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the chest just above his heart and another to his left thigh. An embedded bullet was visible beneath the skin of the man's chest. Clausen ran his finger over it. Davis opened his eyes and told Clausen that the white men had fired first. Before returning to his reporting on the street, Clausen sent for both a white doctor and a black one to tend to the wounded man. Davis survived, though Clausen later remarked, quote, "It appeared impossible for one so desperately wounded ever to recover." A city ambulance bearing a white cross bounced through the rutted streets, collecting the wounded, both black and white. 14 bleeding men, 12 black and 2 of the 3 whites who had been shot, were delivered to Wilmington City County Hospital. The hospital was understaffed. Many of the white nurses and medical assistants had fled, fearing they would be shot by black rioters. The white resident on call, Dr. Ari Zachary, treated the patients, the whites in the white ward, the blacks in the colored ward. 2 of the black men died before they were admitted. Every other patient survived. Dr. Zachary made a notation, quote, "All except the 2 white men were shot in the back."
And the day started, we're 2 days after the election. They have suppressed the vote. Democrats have won the election. And now we are 2 days after the election, and they gather at the Wilmington Light Infantry, and they decide to go over to the Daily Record. And they're going to burn down the only black daily newspaper in the state and one of the few in the country. Can you say a little bit about how the Daily Record and Alexander Manly were used as cover to incite the events of that day that began with the burning of the printing press?
Yeah, Alexander Manly was just a fascinating character. He was actually the grandson of a white governor. He was a very, very committed and dedicated journalist, and he and his brother started the Daily Record, which was the only black daily in the state and one of the very few in the nation. And he really, really advocated for the rights that black men were promised under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and wrote editorials, demanding the unimpeded right to vote, improvements in black neighborhoods which had terrible conditions. And he was very much a champion, and openly a champion of black rights, and was resented very much by the white community. In August of that summer of 1898, he wrote an editorial in response to a speech that was given by a white woman in Georgia who claimed that there was an epidemic of black rapes against white women, and she said the only solution was the lynch rope, and she said, "I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary." He wrote an editorial in response saying essentially that most black men who were lynched for allegedly raping a white woman were in fact had a consensual relationship with the white woman, and secondly, that white men had been raping black women with impunity for years. And this, as you can imagine, had an incendiary effect on the whites in Wilmington, and the white leadership realized what a tool this was. The red shirts wanted to go and lynch Manly that day. They all rode up and were getting ready to, and the white leadership stopped them and said, "No, this will be much more effective at election time in November." This was August. And they said, "Wait then, and we promise you can burn down this newspaper and you can lynch Manly." And they reprinted the editorial and spread it throughout the South to really galvanize whites everywhere, but particularly in North Carolina. And it had a tremendous effect on the white population and turning them against black men.
And talk about selective rage.
Yeah.
To say, no, let's sit on this. It'll be more useful in a couple of months when the election comes. And it is the burning of the press that I think most historians feel really kicked off the events that followed. The white men getting on the trolley car, going down to Brooklyn, which is a predominantly black neighborhood, or I guess a mixed neighborhood to some degree, and just unloading. Can you talk about the events of the coup and the violence of that day, and who some of the forces and some of the leaders were?
Yes, after they burned the newspaper, and they were very disappointed that they couldn't lynch Manly. Manly had been warned a couple of days before, and he fled Wilmington wisely because he would have been lynched that day. But this mob of 1,500 armed men, led by Colonel Waddell, was so riled up, they decided they were just looking for black men to kill. And there was a group of black men at the corner of 4th and Harnett in downtown Wilmington. And just before this, the white mob had besieged a cotton compress where 800 black men worked, and it terrified them. And it sent just this ripple of terror through the black neighborhood. And several men who could, black men, a couple of them had weapons. They gathered on this corner and were confronted by the whites. The whites opened fire and killed 2 or 3 black men immediately. And then the riot was on. The coup had begun, and throughout the rest of the afternoon, white gunmen just roamed through the streets, shooting down every black man they saw. A lot of black men were in their work coveralls, were just trying to get home from work. That's all, and they were shot down in the streets. They also called out the governor. It was a long story, but the Republican governor was terrified of the white supremacists. He was from Wilmington and knew all these people, and they knew how to sort of pull his strings, and they basically forced him into calling out essentially the National Guard, which was the Wilmington Light Infantry and the Naval Reserves, and they came out with a rapid fire gun that had been paid for by the merchants early in the summer to control the black community, and this was a fearsome weapon that shot 400 and some rounds a minute. And they brought that out, so both militias are out there, in addition to the red shirts, in addition to armed white men roaming through the streets and just terrorizing black men. It got so bad that black families, hundreds of them, fled from their homes into the swamps and into a cemetery, hiding from these rioters. Later in the afternoon, Waddell led the mob to City Hall, where they forced the resignation of the mayor, the councilman, again, 3 of the councilmen were black men, and the police chief, and elected themselves as replacements. So the rioters became the mayor, city councilman, and police chief were all leaders of the white supremacy campaign. And Waddell became mayor, yeah, elected.
Yeah, duly and fairly elected. It's amazing, we led a small group down to Wilmington just a couple of weeks ago. We went on a walking tour of 1898, and to walk in the footsteps of the massacre and to see the landscape, and that general store that's set at the corner of 4th and Harnett, it's now just an empty lot.
Right.
And the land, it's almost as if the landscape still remembers, or somebody still remembers, because there's nothing there. But what's amazing is you can look at some of these archival photos, and the trees are still there. It's the same trees, some of the same buildings are still there. And we have this idea sometimes in America, which is ironic given how young our nation is, that history was a long time ago. And this was not a long time ago. And this is something that was remembered in the community, especially in the black community, and purposely misconstrued by those in leadership. And can you talk a little bit, or maybe read, David, about how the event was portrayed in history books? And
yeah, essentially at first it was celebrated. Josephus Daniels organized a white man's parade in Raleigh, invited every white man and woman in the state to Raleigh, and he gave them free passage on the trains to get them there, and he had this massive demonstration celebrating white supremacy. And in the weeks and months afterwards, there were lots of memoirs and books and letters and telegrams where the whites celebrated what had happened, proudly admitted their role in it. But over the years, they realized that this wasn't such a great look. So they mischaracterized what had happened and said they were putting down a black riot. And after that, basically buried. The story was basically buried and forgotten by a lot of the white community. It wasn't forgotten by the black community, but unfortunately there's very little of the black community left. Wilmington was 56% black in 1898. Today it's 18%, so you can see the effect it's had. And I'll read you just 3 excerpts from textbooks. These are North Carolina public school textbooks, and the way they describe what had happened in 1898. This first one is from a 1933 textbook. Quote, there were many Negro office holders in the eastern part of the state, some of whom were poorly fitted for their tasks. This naturally aroused ill feeling between the races. This is 1940, a public school textbook, and actually there are probably a few people still alive who study these books. They'll be very old, but just the connection to the past isn't that far away. Quote, the mass of Negroes became poor citizens. To keep their vote, the carpetbaggers and scalawags allowed them to do very much as they pleased. The worst crimes were not punished. The white people of the South were no longer safe. And finally, another 1940 textbook talks about the KKK and the red shirts. Quote, to put an end to this terrible condition, white people all over the South joined together in a sort of club that they named the Ku Klux Klan. Members of the Ku Klux Klan, dressed as ghosts, scared lawless men into acting decently. On moonlit nights, these men could be seen on horseback, riding to bring order back into the lives of their people. Such sights frightened the Negroes into living better lives. The names of those men, Negro or white, who had done wrong were listed. The next moonlit night, the KKK would visit these men and punish them according to the wrongs they had done. After this, lawless men were not so bold, and crime became less and less.
So, for those of you who are familiar with Wilmington, or maybe you grew up in Wilmington, or you vacation there, and you come down to Wilmington, many of the place names, the Keenans, the Rands, the McCraes, all of these names are still thriving in Wilmington. And the legacy of this is something that has widened the economic divide even further. We have a thriving middle class that was essentially snuffed out. So can you talk a little bit, David, about kind of the economic effects on the region post 1898 and just kind of how things went on from there?
Yeah, Wilmington was a thriving city, and much of it was built on black labor. And once there was a banishment campaign that we haven't talked about, but they took the black leadership and the white Republican leadership, marched them to the train station the day after the riot, put them on trains and said, if you ever come back, we'll kill you. And not one of them ever came back. So that
thousands of people.
And more than 2,000 black people in the weeks and months afterward fled the city and never came back. So the middle class was wiped out, the professional class was wiped out of black men, and the economic base was just sucked out of the city. And it has never recovered. There is not a huge black middle class even today in Wilmington, and there's not a huge professional class, nothing like there was in 1898.
And what's so interesting, we were talking about this in the green room. We don't have a green room. But we were talking about how many of the blacks who were kicked out of the city were these highly skilled laborers. And there was an employment vacuum when there were only white workers left behind that didn't have the skills or the training to step into a cotton compress and to step into these kind of highly skilled roles.
Right, and these white employers were desperate. They were all white supremacists, but they begged the black men to come back because they couldn't perform, the white men couldn't perform the jobs that the black men did. So this had really backfired on them.
I know we'd like to take some questions from the audience in the time we have left. So if you have a question in just a moment, you can raise your hand, and if we don't get a mic to you, I think we'll have a mic to you. We'll speak into the mic so that our friends who are streaming live can hear it. But while we're getting the mics ready, I know we've got some writers here tonight. I see some of my students here tonight, my writing students, and they'll get A's. But I teach fiction writing, and I don't do a lot of nonfiction. So, David, can you talk about the process of pitching this book to your agent or your editor? Like, what is the process of pitching an idea like this that eventually becomes a book?
Yeah, for nonfiction, it helps that it's topical, and in this case, you go, how can it be topical? It was 120 years ago, but I pitched it to my agent and to my publisher. I'd had 2 books published before, which really helps. If you already have an agent and a publisher, it's a huge boom. But I pitched it to them as this important story that tells a lot about where we are today, because this was during the rise of Trump. And the Proud Boys, all this is repeated, gerrymandering, voter suppression,
Misinformation.
Very good. Disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, and it's all being repeated, and this was where it started, particularly in North Carolina, and this was a pivotal event, not only for North Carolina, but for the rest of the country, because of what happened in Wilmington. Black men did not serve on the city council in Wilmington until 1972. This was almost 75 years later. And in 1898, there was exactly one black man in Congress, one left. He was George Henry White, and he was from eastern North Carolina in the district outside Wilmington. And Josephus Daniels, through propaganda and mischaracterization and outright lies, drove him from the state. And so he was the last black man to serve in Congress from North Carolina until 1992. That was almost a century later. And in fact, after 1898, blacks did not vote in significant numbers in North Carolina until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Just one quick number. In 1896, 2 years before the coup, there were 126,000 black men registered in North Carolina, 126,000 registered to vote. By 1902, 4 years later, it was down to 6,100. Questions? Yes, ma'am?
How is it that the rest of North Carolina did not stand up?
Can everybody hear?
She asked, how is it that the rest of North Carolina did not stand up?
You mean at the time? At the
This
time.
wasn't an ignorant time of, we had newspapers, we had transportation, 1898, you know, of course it's less than we got today, you know, it's crazy today. But I mean, there was transportation, there was travel, there were newspapers, there were books published. I mean, there was a lot of other ways of communicating. Where were the rest of the people of North Carolina?
There were newspapers, but they were all controlled by white supremacists in North Carolina, and they all spread the lies and propaganda, and people believed it. So in their minds, there was no reason to rise up. And what's interesting is President McKinley, who was president at the time, had been warned by black ministers from North Carolina and Washington before George Henry White, the congressman, met with him in the White House and said, here's what's coming. They're going to take over, they're going to kill people, they're going to keep them from voting, and McKinley did nothing. After the coup, these same men traveled to Washington to beg McKinley to send troops and to intercede and protect black men's right to vote, and he did absolutely nothing. He never said anything in public about 1898, and of course this was during the Spanish-American War, so he was preoccupied, but still the federal government did nothing. And this gave a strong message throughout the South that you can kill black men in public, you can deny them the right to vote, and nothing will happen. The federal government will not intercede.
So Wilmington was really an example
It really was.
of how to be effective, how to effectively run these campaigns.
And whites throughout the South paid attention.
And for those of you who were here for the first lecture of this series about Charles Chestnut, he was one of the best-known American writers at the time, a black writer from North Carolina, wrote a novel called The Marrow of Tradition that came out 3 years after the race massacre that told the true story through fiction, and it ruined his career. It was reviewed as a bitter, bitter book because it told the true story of the massacre. I think we see this question right there. Go ahead.
David, has there ever been a definitive account of how many lives were lost during the coup? And secondly, this seems like sort of a template for the Tulsa massacres 22 years later. Can you talk about that?
First question. Oh yeah, how many dead? That is a great question. It's been debated. Some accounts say, hundreds. In 2006, there was a commission by the state. It was the 1898 riot commission, and they spent 5 years looking into the causes and effects of the riot. And one thing they did was try to determine how many black men were killed. Their best guess was more than 60, and that's the number I use in the book. So many families took their men off the streets and buried them, and nobody knew what happened. It was such a chaotic, confusing day, I don't think we'll ever really know. As far as Tulsa, the distinction in Wilmington versus all the other so-called race riots in our country, Tulsa and Chicago and in Louisiana and Florida, was in all of those other cases, they were triggered by some sort of contact between a black man and a white woman, even though tensions had been building to that point. That was the spark that set off Tulsa and other so-called riots. In Wilmington, it was all planned. It was planned over time, and there was no one event that triggered it. It was the white supremacists in charge that decided when it was going to happen, and that's a big distinction.
Yes, microphone.
Sorry.
Thank you for the book and thank you for being here tonight. I'm wondering if you can comment on what made the fusionist message effective. I know it's kind of a backstory to the book, but I was struck in reading the book that I can't think of other parallels in U.S. history where there have been effective coalitions between African Americans and poor whites?
I think it was the resentment that the whites had towards the banks, as I mentioned before, the lawyers, the railroads, and just seeking profits and ignoring the needs of the common man. And black men felt the same way. I mean, even more, to a far greater degree. And I think they found some common ground there. That the power structure was not serving them. In the case of black men, it was actively opposing them and trying to kill them. And in the case of the white men, they were just being ignored. I think that's why this common ground, and that's why this white supremacy campaign was so effective with their propaganda in breaking that link and inciting the white men against the blacks. Very effective.
And in many ways challenging white manhood.
Well, that was
In terms of
another
protecting women and things.
Right. The white supremacists realized that black men could vote, and Wilmington had 50% black population, and if they could hold public office, then they may become social equals, particularly in the eyes of white women, and might become attractive to white women, and this was something they could not bear.
Yeah, George.
I'm interested in the white people that were part of the fusionist movement. I'd like to know more names, more personalities, and you said they were all sent to the train station and sent away. Is that really true, that all of the white fusionists left?
Many of them. Some had seen the handwriting on the wall in the days and weeks leading up to the coup and had changed sides, so they were spared. But basically the white Republican and fusionist leadership was banished from the city, and they never came back. They were terrified. They would have been killed if they'd come back. So it was not only the black leadership, but the white fusionist leadership that was banned.
And there's a story in the book about the governor coming home to vote in Wilmington and having to sneak out in a train car because they were going to lynch the governor.
Oh,
because he was a fusionist governor.
Yeah, and he was, as I said, was from Wilmington, and they had to hide him in the baggage car when they went through these white supremacist towns. Maxton was one of them, and the red shirts boarded the train and tried to kill him. They were going to lynch him, and he barely made it back to the governor's mansion in Raleigh, which was surrounded by red shirts. There was a mob there surrounding the mansion, and he barely got in there. He was absolutely terrified and intimidated, which is why he did nothing. He could have called in federal troops, but the white supremacists threatened to assassinate him if he did, and they would have. So he just kept quiet.
So were people like Russell, did they go into the private sector? Were they reabsorbed into the Democratic Party? Did they?
He got out of politics and he begged Duke, the head American Tobacco Company in New York. He was begging him for a job. He was desperate. He was looking for a job, and he sort of faded from politics.
Yes, Mark.
Yeah, and thank you very much, David. You had mentioned some of the textbooks, 1933, 1940, and yet if I mention this to my students, Wilmington, today, you just still get a blank.
Right. Oh, it's not taught. It's not in the textbooks.
It's not in the textbooks. I mean, so in a way, you don't need to go back to 1940.
No.
You could go to 2024, and maybe you won't see the same kind of racist language. Maybe all you see is nothing, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
It's very, very limited. It's sort of, well, there's an unfortunate series of events, and there was a political dispute, and some black people got killed. And that was all. Very perfunctory. Nothing to it. I have had several teachers come up to me at book talks and saying that they teach it now in their classes, even though it's not officially part of the curriculum. And I do worry what's going to happen because the legislature, I forget it was the House or the Senate in North Carolina, passed a law similar to Florida's that banned the teaching of black history, or certain aspects of black history. And I'm sure this book would be one of the targets. And I don't know where that stands now, but that's very worrisome. That there will be legislation to keep this kind of thing from being taught.
Yeah, right over the mic.
I did it.
Right.
I thought the anecdote about black people and white people living side by side in some communities in Wilmington was particularly striking, considering that they would go on to be so easily influenced by the propaganda. Can you speak about this relationship, whether it was particularly amicable?
Yeah, there was one lawyer, very prominent lawyer named William Henderson, a black lawyer, who really thought his white neighbors would come to his aid. He wasn't worried, I mean, he was worried and concerned, but he really thought, well, that's going to save me because we have white friends, it's okay. Well, the red shirts came to his house the night of the coup and gave him 24 hours to leave town, and they marched him and his family to the train station, put him on the train and sent him away, and he never came back. And this happened to a lot of black people. In fact, Alex Manley wrote in the days before the coup saying, there are still some good whites among us. Don't be unduly alarmed. There are men of law and courage and compassion, and they will come to our rescue when these red shirts come to get us. And of course, that never came to pass. But that was because blacks and whites lived together and knew each other. Not in every neighborhood. There was plenty of segregation, but in certain neighborhoods they did.
Thank you.
Yes, right.
Why do you think Tulsa is so much better known?
It's a good question. It was very dramatic. More people were killed. The police and airplanes were involved. It came later when there was more mass communication. I think that's a big part of it. And I'm not an expert on Tulsa, but to my knowledge, it wasn't buried. It wasn't actively covered up, to my knowledge. Maybe it was, but I don't think there was the kind of effort there was in Wilmington. And Wilmington was a smaller city.
Why do you think the public educators in North Carolina didn't pick this up as a significant story in the 60s and 70s and 80s?
I would imagine that most of them were Democrats at the time, were Southern segregationist Democrats, and certainly didn't see any need to have that kind of story told to their children. That's my guess.
I grew up in Gadsden, North Carolina, came from mill culture, and I never learned about the Lower Mill Strike, which was one of the largest labor movements in American history. It happened in my hometown. A woman who shared the last name of my grandfather, who also came from the mills, was the face of the mill strike and was eventually murdered because of her involvement. And when I learned about it, I asked my parents, and they had no idea. And my grandfather was 22 years old when it happened, and never talked about it, because things that are uncomfortable that might get you fired, you don't talk about it.
It shows you the power of historical narrative. It's very important. Who gets to tell the story?
How did it come onto your radar screen that you came up with this idea? And then I'm just in awe of your research that you did. Can you talk about the process of how long that took you, and did you get any oral histories?
I went to high school and college in North Carolina and never heard of this event. I didn't hear about it until 1998 when there was a centennial in Wilmington. I read some newspaper stories about it, and I said, how could I not hear about this, and how could this happen in the United States? So I kind of tucked it away and decided someday I was going to write about it, and it took a long while, but I finally decided to write about it. And you asked about the research?
Yeah, how long did that?
That was a couple of years of research. Fortunately, I live in Chapel Hill, or in Durham, outside Chapel Hill, and the Wilson Library has the Southern Historical Collection and the North Carolina Historical Collection, which has a lot of documents, original documents from this period. And a lot of it came from there, a lot of it came from newspaper accounts. As I mentioned, it was extremely well covered. There were also letters, diaries, telegrams, a lot of things written by people involved, both black and white. Unfortunately, the Daily Record was burned and all the back copies disappeared, because that would have been a terrific resource. But a lot of the black people fled to towns that had black newspapers, and they were interviewed a few days after the coup by the black press there. So I got some terrific first-hand personal accounts through the black press, even though the Daily Record was gone and no black reporter could have gone to Wilmington, they would have been killed. But it was more difficult to get black accounts than white accounts for obvious reasons.
And I think also, just to piggyback off what he said for your question, I learned about it when I was in graduate school. I was at UNC Greensboro for a master's degree, and I was taking a class with a black professor named Sally Ann Ferguson, and the class was called North Carolina Literature, and I thought, well, I'll do well in that, I'm from North Carolina. And so I went to the bookstore and I was looking for the books, and they were all by someone named Charles Chestnut. I'd never heard of Charles Chestnut. And in reality, she was teaching a seminar on Charles Chestnut, but she knew if she called it Charles Chestnut, nobody would take it. And so I didn't learn about the race massacre until I was 23 years old, studied under a black professor by a black writer who was obscured because he wrote about the massacre. And then my wife didn't learn about it. She was raised in Wilmington and didn't learn about it until she studied under a black professor in college who taught her about it. And so I guess what my point is like what we learn matters, and the tools that are at our disposal in the classroom come to bear on how history is passed on or not.
And it's pretty shameful that it took almost a century for this true story to be told. That's pretty telling.
Maybe one more question if somebody's got the mic. Yes?
I don't have a question, I have a statement.
Oh.
For the educators amongst you here, the Howard Zinn Education Project is one of the best. The People's History of America, I think it's called, Howard Zinn. He is the best, deeply resourced, amazing. You can find out everything you need to teach students in school about African American history. And reminding your folks that black people have lived through pain, suffering, agony, torture. White children can certainly sit in a classroom and learn about it.
I'm for it.
Thank you for that. Maybe one, yes, last question.
David, have you addressed a group in Wilmington recently since the book? How Wilmington embraced this? And with the commission of 2006, you said, how widespread was that promoted? And did Wilmington look at any reparations or any mea culpas through all of this?
Reparations is an interesting question. In 1998, as I mentioned, there was a centennial, and you probably know about this. UNC Wilmington brought back descendants on both sides and tried reconciliation. They had white choirs from churches and black choirs come together. They put on plays and really made an attempt at reconciliation, and it went pretty well. They came up with a declaration that told the true story of what happened. They finally addressed the true story. But when the issue of reparations was brought up by black citizens, that's when it was ruptured. Because the whites didn't want to hear about it, and there was also a lot of resentment from the white community saying, well, this happened more than 100 years ago, why are you dredging up this ancient history? And I wasn't personally involved. So it kind of fell apart, even though it had gone pretty well, and there was some reconciliation, so it was pretty successful for the most part, except when reparations came up.
Well, y'all have been a wonderful audience and a very engaged audience, so thank you all for joining us here this evening, and for the folks who joined us online. And please follow along on the website, unca.edu/commonword. We'll have some information up this summer about Charles Frazier's 13 Moons, but I hope to see all of you back here in the fall for the 3 events that I'll be hosting then. But thank you so much for a great evening.
Thank you for coming.
I'm just